Okay, so this is basically a short book that I'm working on Kant's conception of rationalizing, and I'll be presenting some of the main ideas, one exegetical idea, and then what I want to focus on philosophical debate. Basically, I want to problematize Kant's conception of rationalizing after I've explained it. So the first two sections will be brief. I briefly want to talk about what rationalizing is and the functions. The functions will be important for the critical discussion. And then I want to say a bit about the mechanism behind rationalizing and basically do some exegetical work. But then my main interest is in the critical discussion, because that's the part that that I think I can develop the most. And it might also be of interest to people who are not just Kant scholars, but interested ethicists. So first, part one, what is rationalizing? Rationalizing, translation of the German Vernünfteln. And there are very many different translations. I'll go with rationalizing because it contains the term rationality, just like the German Vernünfteln. So it is a form of, or it is an exercise of rationality, rational capacities, but there's something, at least for the case that I'll be concerned with, something is going wrong here. And I think Vernünfteln, at least in current German, does sort of have that connotation that it's reasoning just a little, reasoning insufficiently. Now, I should also point out, and I've been discussing that with Thomas quite a bit, that the way Kant uses the term, and he actually uses it quite a bit throughout all of his works, it sometimes means reasoning, not in any deficient way, but just someone using reason. It sometimes means reasoning with minor defects. Someone reasons when actually they should rather be acting, or they should be obeying a law or an order. But in many cases, and these are the cases that I'll be focusing on, rationalizing means or describes a form of severe self-deception or dialectical reasoning. And I should also say that the way I use rationalizing is a term for self-deception specifically about moral matters. And why that is will become clear when I talk about the underlying mechanism. Basically, if we want to talk about self-deception about prudence or about your social standing or something like that, we would need a different mechanism, because pure practical reason wouldn't be playing the role that it plays for rationalizing or self-deception about morality. And here's a lengthy quote that I'm not going to read to you. That's basically the most important passage for rationalizing at the end of the groundwork, groundwork one. Just want to draw your attention. So Kant here basically introduces rationalizing and says why it is important for him. And I want to just draw your attention to the stuff that's in bold, where Kant says there arises a natural dialectic, i.e. a propensity to rationalize against those strict laws of duty and to cast doubt on their validity, or at least their purity and strictness, and where possible, to make them better suited to our wishes and inclinations, i.e. fundamentally corrupt them. So I think this shows that rationalizing is here introduced as a severe problem, or the propensity to rationalize. Definitely something is going wrong when you rationalize. So roughly the story is that when agents rationalize, they make up excuses and apparent justifications. In the book, I argue that they start with excuses and then move on to proper justifications. Basically, they seek excuses or apparent justifications to vindicate either what they already did and sort of acknowledge as immoral, or what they want to do but think might be morally problematic. And when they do that, they subtly change their conception of what can be morally justified. And they do that by basically changing their idea of the most abstract and fundamental properties of morality, strictness and purity, as Kant calls it in this passage. So these are the most abstract features that rationalizing can cast into doubt. One important claim that I'll be not supporting now, but that I just want to flag, is that a lot of people think rationalizing is mainly a problem of motivation. people telling themselves that they acted for high and mighty motives when in fact they acted out of self-interest. And obviously that is an important theme that comes up again and again in Kant. But I actually think that rationalizing is even more interesting because it can also lead people to deceive themselves about what it is that they morally ought to do, meaning they might judge incorrectly about their duties, right? So not even act in accordance with duty, but outrightly violate moral commands and feel vindicated or justified in doing so. And a few scholars have recently acknowledged that this is the case, although the standard picture would be that this is basically a version of the idea of introspective opacity. But I think rationalizing is more than that, and I think the functions that rationalizing serves also shows that. And then finally, one of the, so while this passage is very important, we actually find a lot of interesting examples for rationalizing throughout Kant's works, especially in part 3 and 4 of the Religion, where Kant, for instance, discusses how certain religious institutions can inspire rationalizing, reinforce rationalizing, propose new strategies of rationalizing. So apart from these conceptual discussions of rationalizing, there's quite a bit of material in a bunch of Kant's works to understand what's going on when we rationalize. Okay, why is it that Kant talks about rationalizing in a prominent passage such as the end of Groundwork 1, and why does he discuss examples of rationalizing throughout his works? I think I have 4 functions for rationalizing. The first 2 will become important for my critical discussions. I want to highlight these. I think rationalizing helps Kant to answer a bunch of questions that come up on, or that arise on his account, and that might be a problem for him. For instance, you might wonder, how is it even possible that for common agents who, as Kant claims, already have a correct grasp of morality due to common human reason, right? Groundwork 1 is all about what we already know or are aware of morally, just in virtue of having common human reason. So how then is it possible that someone endowed with common human reason would ever judge incorrectly about morality? And Kant's answer to that is that, well, these people have rationalized, right? You have an original correct grasp of morality, but since rationalizing is widespread, constant danger, it might well be that people basically tell very different stories about morality than what Kant ascribes to the common agent in Groundwork 1. But that's not because they express a valid conception of morality that could challenge Kant, but rather because they have rationalized and they need to be corrected. A version of that is that you might also wonder why it is that other philosophers advocate incorrect conceptions of duty, moral worth, agency. In Kant's times, these were eudaimonists, the popular philosophers. Nowadays, you might think of rather the utilitarians, consequentialists. How is it that, you know, intelligent, theoretically intelligent, educated people would get it so wrong? And Kant says, well, what's going on here is that a lot of uncritical, non-Kantian ethical theory is just a sophisticated form of rationalizing. So rationalizing serves as a way to explain why either other non-theorists or other theorists would have divergent views of morality, views that conflict with Kant's, and also to explain why these views are wrong. I'll critically discuss it towards the end of my Then I just want to briefly highlight 2 further functions. One is that in Groundwork 1, rationalizing clearly explains why we need critical practical philosophy. So basically, end of Groundwork 1 is where we get the transition from common human reason to critical philosophy. And the reason for that is, even though we have a grasp of what we ought to do via our common human reason, this grasp is constantly threatened by rationalizing. So we need to better systematize, understand our moral intuitions, or our basic moral grasps in order to fight rationalizing. And then finally, I think rationalizing also explains how it is that people can still be moral agents, be under moral law, and yet have wrong beliefs about their duty. Namely, Kant would say that agents never completely lose their original moral insights, but rationalizing introduces additional, supposedly relevant considerations that make it difficult but never impossible to judge correctly about morality. This is quite a controversial claim on the part of Kant, but one that I will not be critically scrutinizing today. So let me briefly talk about the mechanism behind rationalizing, and I'll be playing what I call Kantian Cluedo here. So basically, something is going wrong when we rationalize, but who is the culprit? You know, who is doing something wrong here, and who are the accomplices? So firstly, I just want to flag there is discussion of the internal lie in Metaphysics of Morals 430. I think that is a very weird and unhelpful story that Kant gives us there. So I'm not going to be talking about this inner lie. I'm criticizing this quite a bit in my book, and there's also a very nice discussion in a recent book by Laura Papish on that. So I don't think that's a very good way to understand rationalizing or self-deception in general. I think one thing that should be clear is that rationalizing is a rational activity, right? That's why I like the term rationalizing, because it makes clear that it is rationality going wrong here. So let's look at the different rational capacities available that agents have and see what's potentially going wrong here. A few scholars, such as Sally Sedgwick and Owen Ware in his recent book, have suggested that common human reason might be the culprit, meaning that basically common human reason deceives itself when it rationalizes. I think that's not quite correct. I do think that rationalizing is possible, only possible, because of the insufficient grasp of underlying structures that agents have if all they have available is common human reason. If they had a better understanding of the underlying structures, they might be in a better or even perfect position to not fall prey to their rationalizing. However, common human reason is also an agent's moral compass and can't be inherently deficient, I think, because otherwise it would make no sense that Kant starts his groundwork with systematizing and later even vindicating common human reason. So we should say that maybe common human reason is an accessory to rationalizing because because of the insufficient grasp of underlying structures, but it's not the main culprit. I think the main culprit is empirical practical reason, specifically prudence, meaning empirical practical reason in the service of one's own happiness. And there's one interesting passage where Kant says that we have an internal advocate before the court of conscience. I think it makes sense to think that empirical practical reason is this internal advocate that advocates in behalf of the agent before the internal court of self-evaluation. And what it does, empirical practical reason, is that it devises pseudo-justifications and finds excuses in order to promote an agent's sensuous ends at the expense of morality. I think it makes sense to think of these pseudo-justifications and excuses as psychological means. So they are means, but they are a special kind of means, namely psychological ones. They are means in at least two senses. One is that it is sometimes the case that we need an excuse or a supposed justification in order to push us over the edge and let us pursue our happiness at the expense of morality. If we didn't have anything like an excuse or a supposed justification, we would do the right thing, which would be great, but would be bad for our happiness. So since empirical practical reason, prudence, finds its tasks with finding means to our happiness, some of the means it might be finding are excuses, pseudo-justifications. And then secondly, in a retrospective use, sometimes these means, psychological means, help us avoid or ease pangs of conscience and self-loathing and thus contributing to our happiness. Now, what's interesting is you might wonder why self-loathing is relevant here. That's because I think one overlooked culprit for rationalizing, or capacity that plays an important role for rationalizing, is pure practical reason. So the main culprit, the entity doing rationalizing, if you can use these agential terms for subcapacities, is empirical practical reason, but pure practical reason also makes an extremely important contribution. Now, the contribution is that we would not think that we need to find pseudo excuses or pseudo justifications if it weren't the case that we have what I call interest in being morally justified. This interest stems from our recognition of the authority of morality, right? So creatures like us recognize that morality is of unconditional value, and you find that especially in the second critique. This is extremely important for our self-esteem. We acknowledge that our highest vocation is morality. So clearly that creates an interest in being morally justified, or you might also say an interest in not thinking of ourselves as a morally bad person. And this interest persists even when violating duty, right? So in terms of happiness, often the best thing we could do would be to promote our happiness at the expense of duty and tell us a story that satisfies our interest in being morally justified, such that there's no self-loathing, pangs of conscience, and yet we can pursue our happiness. Okay, so I want to say a bit about this interest in being morally justified, because I've been in discussion with a few Kantians, for instance, Jens Timmermann, who doesn't like this idea of an interest in being morally justified stemming from pure practical reason, because I think it is a natural Kantian impulse to want to preserve pure practical reason in its purity as a faculty that can't possibly incentivize any wrongdoing or any forms of irrationality. So here's my story. The rational interest in being morally justified is rooted in pure practical reason. And this interest pushes agents or incentivizes agents to devise excuses and pseudo justification to avoid pain that she would not feel were it not for the effect of pure practical reason on her. Interestingly, that also means that rationalizing is, in a way, an acknowledgement of the authority of the moral law, right? Because only beings who acknowledge this authority would ever feel a need to come up with pseudo justifications for their immoral activities. Now, an interest, and I mean interest here in the Kantian sense, is the combination of the pleasure with the faculty of desire, so far as this connection is judged through the understanding to be valid according to a universal rule, if only for the subject. But what I take from this is that interest is principle guided and reflected and can have a source in pure practical reason. So I do think on this Kantian picture of what an interest is, an interest in being morally justified can count as an interest, and this interest can be rooted in pure practical reason. Now, here's where I'm less sure. Kant says that respect for the moral law is a moral interest. So there are moral interests. Now, I'm unsure as to whether the interest in moral justification is the same interest as respect for the moral law, in which case we could say that trying to come up with excuses, pseudo justifications, is maybe a residual effect of respect when an agent does not act out of respect or wants to do an action other than what respect requires, right? So that would be one option. There is just one moral interest, but in some cases, this moral interest can push us not towards doing the right thing, but rather making up excuses. It could also be that this is a different interest from respect, but one also rooted in pure practical reason. And I should say that I'm actually a bit unsure how we can settle this debate, right? Because I'm a bit unsure how to distinguish between two very different impacts that one interest can have and two different interests, if they are both rooted in the same capacity. And I'm also not entirely sure whether it greatly matters for my claims. But if you have thoughts on that, feel free to share them with me. I should also say that in the second critique, Kant suggests that there is only a single interest of the pure practical use of reason. So I guess according to what Kant himself says, the first reading that respect is the moral interest and the residual effect can be to look for moral justifications if you can't satisfy the demands of respect. That seems better backed up by textual evidence. But I also don't think it would be implausible to say that these are two different interests. So this, okay, I think this is just a summary of what I've claimed so far. So I think there are two driving forces of rationalizing. The first being self-love, and pure practical, empirical practical reason is at least in the form of prudence, is in the service of our self-love. Rationalizing can be understood as an abuse of rational capacities in the sole service of self-love, and irregardless of what pure practical reason says we should do. And then the second driving force is what we can maybe call respect's evil twin. Rationalizing only makes sense for agents who accord authority to the moral law. And this acknowledgement of authority creates an interest in being morally justified, an interest rooted in pure practical reason, and without which we would see no need to rationalize. So these are the two main contributions to make rationalizing of, you might even say, the two main conditions of the possibility of rationalizing for creatures like us: self-love and pure practical reason, creating an interest in being morally justified. So this is the scholarly exegetical part of my talk, and I want to look at two problems for this framework. I should make one assumption clear. For what is to come, I assume that some ethical theories are more demanding than Kant's. I should also flag some of this is inspired by my work on over-demandingness. Thomas already mentioned that that's one of the other interests that I have. So some ethical theories are more demanding than Kant's, meaning they are less in an agent's self-interest to adopt instead of Kant's theory. One example that's often mentioned is impartially maximizing the good, maybe the most standard form of consequentialism of utilitarianism. A lot of people in the debate think that this theory is more demanding than Kant's ethics. It obviously depends on how you read Kant's ethics, but certainly if you have sympathies for a more virtue ethical type of Kant, a more metaphysics of morals inspired Kant, you would certainly think, or you're likely to think that standard utilitarianism is more demanding in the sense that it requires greater sacrifices in terms of your self-love. Okay, so this, I think, creates the first problem. Now, I already said that one of the things that rationalizing should do is it should help Kant explain why agents or other theorists would ever either adopt theories that diverge from Kant's own, or articulate certain intuitions that Kant thinks are thoroughly mistaken. But it is very much the question how a rationalizer could ever create principles, ideas, theories that are more demanding than Kant's, right? Because what rationalizers want to do is they want to get away with more, right? They want to make more room for their self-love. So you can easily see how a rationalizer creates less demanding theories or justifies certain exceptions to Kantian moral theory. But how would they ever devise more demanding principles or theories? But there are such principles and theories. Standard classical utilitarianism, for instance. So it seems that rationalizing as a theory or as something that should kind of help explain Kant why there are different ethical theories fails. Or you could also put it in a different way. It seems that rationalizing, as I explained it, and I think as Kant thinks of it, puts more demanding theories seemingly in a better position than competing ones, right? Because you can always tell a story for why a less demanding theory is just the upshot of rationalizing, but you can't really do that for a more demanding theory. Moreover, I think it's clear that a theory is not better, an ethical theory is not better, because it is more strict or more demanding, right? So it seems that not all deviations from the Kantian moral law or from Kantian ethical thoughts are self-love driven, yet rationalizing can only explain self-love driven forms of self-deception. So Kant couldn't explain why there are act utilitarians. He could maybe explain why there are eudaimonists or certain virtue ethicists, maybe. Now here's a response that I think is sort of plausible, but leads us to the second problem, which I think is the actually tough problem. So you could argue that self-love, as Kant uses it, is not a form of simple egoism. The ends that come under self-love can be other-directed, right? Self-love can be extremely broad, is maybe merely a sort of, I shouldn't say formal principle, because that makes it sound as like a moral principle, but it's basically, it's not a narrow principle of egoism. Self-love could plausibly include ends or aims such as maximizing the good or effective altruism. And that means that justifying a principle or coming up with a principle that tells you to maximize the good could still be understood as rationalizing, as it potentially modifies our initial conception of morality, which is not a consequentialist one, and it can encourage violation of perfect duties and neglect of self-perfection, and can be understood as driven by self-love in this broad sense, where basically everything that isn't motivated by the categorical imperative is self-love. Now, this, of course, is all under the assumption that Kant got it right, that his ethics is correct, right? And if that were the case, then my response shows how Kant could explain how there are act consequentialists, even though you firstly might think that there is no way that they could rationalize a conception that makes life even tougher for them. However, you might well respond that we should make more room for maximizing the good, or that this is actually an appealing ethical principle to do as much good as you can to, you know, help effectively the worst off. So you might think that this is a plausible principle, and you might also worry whether Kant is the true rationalizer. So presumably, if you are a convinced utilitarian, you might think that saying that imperfect duties to others, such as beneficence, allows for latitude, but that makes morality much less demanding, depending on how you read latitude, and it looks like a foul excuse. It looks like a pseudo justification, right? Or that you can't. To pick up on an example that was already mentioned, that you wouldn't be willing to torture one child to save the city, right? It would be much better to save the city, to save so many lives. So it looks like when you say that there are certain absolute duties that we may never violate, isn't that rationalizing in some situations? Maybe trying to protect you psychologically against all the guilt that would come with having tortured a child, but you know, if you think that the right solution is saving the city, you might worry that Kant actually presents quite a bit of rationalizing theory here. And that leads me to my final problem, that if rationalizing is to be an explanation of how we come to build bad ethical theories, and if it is to be a charge against other ethicists, as Kant sometimes uses it. So he sometimes accuses the popular philosophers, the eudaimonists, of rationalizing. But if that is the case, then I think it would be very good if we had what I call theory-independent criteria to determine who is rationalizing, right? Otherwise, we basically have an unfruitful debate where Kantians think they got it right and the utilitarians are rationalizing, and the utilitarians think, well, they obviously got it right, the Kantians rationalize, so both sides yell rationalizer at each other. So ideally, we can work out certain criteria that allow us to say someone is rationalizing without first having to settle the very difficult, very important issue, who is right? Is it Kant? Is it the utilitarians? And I don't think I have enough material here to really give you a great story, but here are a few ideas. And after that, I'm done. And if you have more ideas, great. Or if you think these are not suitable, let's debate. So I think one way to determine that someone rationalizes theory. Okay, thanks, Thomas. 5 minutes, and I think I'm on my, yeah, I'm on the penultimate slide. So one way to determine whether someone rationalizes theory independently is inconsistency between principles. So if we find someone who is a deontologist about their own rights and a consequentialist about the rights of others, that's at least that raises red flags, right? Or someone who, what's the example? Actually, that's a bit embarrassing, but so I find myself to be a Marxist whenever there is a fair trade option that's more expensive. You know, that I always think, well, fair trade, you know, is still trade, and it just, you know, we need to overthrow capitalism, so I might as well go for the cheaper option. But when it comes to my own private property, I'm much less of a Marxist. That's, you know, just one example for someone who jumps between principles, and it seems that their own self-interest always comes out on top. Now, obviously, there might be certain cases where we ought to apply different principles in different domains. So this is not a ironclad principle that works every time. A second one is hypocrisy, holding others to different standards than oneself. Again, I think that shows that a person is potentially engaged in rationalizing or has bought into rationalizing ideas. But again, it might sometimes be the case that the person is in a relevantly different situation, and thus different treatment is appropriate. A third criterion could be confirmation or my side bias. Someone is never considering objections and only ever looking for arguments and reasons supporting their own position. One thing you might say is what I'm trying to say here is that it is suspicious when self-love tends to come out on top in Nations reasoning. I think that's right, but we should also, again, bear in mind that just because one ethical theory makes more room for our self-love than another ethical theory doesn't mean that theory must be wrong, right? It might well be that the correct ethical theory does make quite a bit of room for our self-love. And that's very much a substantive issue that we need to settle in ethical debate. So I wouldn't want to say that whenever someone comes up with an argument that vindicates their own interests, that must be rationalizing, because their arguments might well be valid. A few things to flag about these principles. I think all of these principles or ideas require us to look at patterns. They're not something we can identify in a single judgment, but rather we need to see a few judgments and see whether different principles are applied. Maybe in the case of hypocrisy, we can identify that in a single case, but usually we need to look at patterns of reasoning. And another thing that I think Kant never acknowledges, that it could be the case that someone who rationalizes still gets it right. They might be engaged in profoundly self-love, my side biased reasoning, but they might still come up with a valid moral principle, a valid excuse that should be taken into consideration. And then finally, as I already said, these criteria are quite minimal, and I'd be keen to see if you have other ideas for other minimal or more substantive ways to diagnose abuses of rational capacities without making assumptions, or at least without making controversial assumptions about what the correct ethical theory is. Thanks for your attention.